Goblins are the best. They can take so many forms in the imagination because historically, they were simply the little boogeymen who tamper with our stuff. And let's be honest, they've created so many adventuring characters by raiding helpless villages.
You know, goblins are just the quintessential level 1 baddie. The very first game that I ever ran, the players were infiltrating a goblin camp. You know, it's just such a classic trope for a D&D game. And, you know, the players, they captured a goblin, which I wasn't really prepared for, and then I had to voice this NPC goblin and give him a name on the fly, and I think I gave him the name of, like, Gary or something because I couldn't think of anything else. So it was a very lofty start to my Dungeon Master career.
I really love goblins. They're just this great opportunity for DMs to go really big with their behavior and voice. And they also embody just so many different personalities. At one point, you can go from being just this murderous little chaos gremlin to a simpering and cowardly creature that'll do or say anything to escape. And then they can just turn on a dime and go back to stabbing you.
Goblins are so great because they have this bizarre hierarchical structure that is about getting ahead in every way you can. They go about it in different ways though, sure, but they are obsessed with the idea of being on top. While bugbears may seek to show you who is dominant through great feats of prowess, your typical goblins are obsessed with strength. If you can kill the leader, then you become the leader. Hobgoblins, on the other hand, actually have a quite rigid and formal political structure, but politics to them is just a fancier version of Goblin 1 smashing Goblin 2 over the head with their club.
Goblins are cowards, pure and simple, and for good reason. A goblin doesn't fear death because it doesn't know what's on the other side. It fears death because it knows what's on the other side.
Traditionally, goblins are survivalists. They won't get into a fight unless they have the upper hand, usually through an ambush and overwhelming numbers. But once a party of goblins becomes outnumbered, it's every goblin for themselves. Looking at the goblin boss in 5e, it has an ability called Redirect Attack, where it uses another nearby goblin as a meat shield. It's quite the selfish ability, but that's survival.
So there's a saying that the first encounter in Lost Mines of Phandelver is the single biggest cause of TPKs in all of 5th edition, and I think that's for good reason. Goblins are super sneaky. If you play them even at all strategically, they can demolish a party. A bonus action to hide or disengage, these little buggers can be brutal. Throw in a nilbog or two for pure chaos. If you're hiding in a dark forest, good night. And they have some of the best voices.
The Goblin is the very first monster that I ever encountered in Dungeons & Dragons. In the Red Box D&D set, you're introduced to the game through a solo adventure. Within the first 3 paragraphs, you have a fighter that is going down and exploring a cave, and they are introduced to a ugly, short, gray-skinned man that waves his sword at you and attacks. And of course, as soon as you hit it, then it is going to scream and run away. And that is the Goblin. Of course, you'll meet it a little bit later, as the Goblin was working for Bargle, one of the most infamous magic users. That's been over 40 years ago, and I still treasure that moment, being introduced to D&D with a combat encounter with a goblin.
I think the reason people remember goblins so much is because it is a very fun and very common monster to use for somebody's first ever D&D session. They're super low challenge rating, they are homicidally insane most of the time, and they make for pretty memorable encounters.
Nothing else says you're playing a fantasy role-playing game quite like rolling dice up against a group of goblins. For newer players, fighting a group of goblins at the start of a campaign is pretty much rite of passage. Goblins have incredible range, being equal parts goofy and lighthearted to being devious and dangerous. That lighthearted side has players connect with them, and often the party really tries to turn them into a companion. They are easily one of my favorite things to run against a group of adventurers, but also one of my favorite player options to play when building a character. Their focus on community puts them at odds with society, but at the same time it's their greatest strength, as they understand how the whole is greater than the sum of its parts. A goblin character can help the party realize the power of working together, while the goblin gains a sense of individuality.
It just really feels like this creature that's driven on pure impulse, and you don't need to think too deeply when you're role-playing a goblin.
Goblins make for some great comedic NPCs, as well as a great player option. In one of my games, one of my players was a goblin who was modeled after Dora the Explorer. They had a magical backpack, a map mimic, and they were on the hunt for one of their inventions named Boots. And this was a dark and serious campaign, and through collaboration, we made this silly goblin character feel like they belonged in the setting.
Aside from dragons, goblins are, I think, one of the most well-known Dungeons & Dragons enemies. They're basically the de facto standard. And here with the 5th edition, they're a lot of players' first introduction to Dungeons & Dragons monsters, so they're so iconic, you can't help but think Dungeons & Dragons and little green guys with pointy noses and sharp swords.